Namaste, good morning, and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Sarva Jiva Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Svikritam cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrusham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tannamami Deva Deva Ramakrishnam Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha. We salute Sri Ramakrishna, God of gods and Lord of existence, who of his own free will took on human birth and lived a luminous life of divine play for the destruction of human ills. We salute that incarnation, Paramahamsa Ramakrishna, who was worshipped by pure-hearted disciples like Vivekananda, and who was ceaselessly served by Sri Sarada Devi, the Divine Mother herself. Om Tava Katamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimadatatam Bhuvi Grinandiye Bhurida Jana. O Lord, your nectar-like words are praised by the wise and full of auspiciousness. They destroy the curse of evil, bring good to those who hear them, and bring new life to those who are scorched by the ills of worldly existence. Magnanimous indeed are they who spread your message. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om, peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So we'll continue our study of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna where we left off last time. And so we were on December 14th, 1883, and in the middle of page 336. So December 14th, 1883 was a Friday. So it wasn't crowded with many devotees, most of whom would come on Saturday and Sunday and on special holidays. But it was a special day. It was the last day of the lunar month on the Bengali calendar, and also it was the full moon day. And so Sri Ramakrishna was very happy that M was there and that M was going to spend the night as well. So in what we had immediately read at the end of the last class, Sri Ramakrishna was talking about how to live in the world as a householder. That one should live in the world, he said, as the mudfish lives in the mud, but is untouched by the mud. So as I explained last time, for those who are not familiar with it, the mudfish is one that buries in the mud. But if you take it out of the mud, it looks like almost a transparent layer on it. It's extremely slippery. And so the mud all just falls off. None of the mud sticks to it. And so that was used as an analogy for how a householder should live in the world. Living in the world with the responsibilities and activities of a householder, but through detachment, not allowing the world to stick to the mind. So Then we continue. The master noticed that M was listening to his words with great attention. Master looking at M. One can realize God if one feels intense dispassion for worldly things. A man with such dispassion feels that the world is like a forest on fire. He regards his wife and children as a deep well. If he really feels that kind of dispassion, he renounces home and family. It's not enough for him to live in the world in a spirit of detachment. So here he is telling him about the spirit of detachment, which would leave one to leave family and home. That time can come when to the person the world and one's family life seems to be a forest on fire. And just as if you're in a forest, living in a forest, and the forest catches fire, you run for your life. So one runs to escape worldly entanglement. And when he regards his wife and children as a deep well into which one is going to sink and never get out, then also one would run from the world. He says that then it is not enough for him to live in the world in a spirit of detachment. So here we have to remember that M was a highly qualified spiritual aspirant, a high adhikari, as we say in Sanskrit, one of high level of fitness, preparedness for the spiritual life. He hadn't started out that way, but in the couple of years that he had spent with Sri Ramakrishna now it was almost 2 years. In a couple of months from this time in the book, it would become 2 years that he had been with Sri Ramakrishna. Under the guidance and the influence of Sri Ramakrishna, his spiritual life had flowered. And so M was one who was coming to the point that Sri Ramakrishna was speaking about. And so M does come to the point, as we see in the gospel later, does come to the point where he begs Sri Ramakrishna to allow him to renounce the world. In fact, he does that on more than one occasion. And Sri Ramakrishna says, no, that's not for you. You are to remain in the world and show others how to live in the world. And so there were those like him, even Girish Chandra Ghosh, and there were others who Sri Ramakrishna told to live in the world. And Nag Mahashaya, the greatest of Sri Ramakrishna's householder disciples. He also wanted to renounce the world. And Sri Ramakrishna said, no, you must stay in the world in order to show the way to others. So what Sri Ramakrishna is saying here certainly applied to him. It applied to Nag Mahashaya as well. But Sri Ramakrishna wouldn't allow them, in spite of that, to renounce the world. So he continues, woman and gold alone is Maya. If Maya is once recognized, it feels ashamed of itself and takes to flight. A man put on a tiger skin and tried to frighten another man, but the latter said, ah, I have recognized you. You are our Hari. At that, the man dressed in the skin went away smiling to frighten someone else. So that's a beautiful example. And sometimes the same example he would use that I appeared in the skin to frighten a child out of play. And the child says, no, I recognize you. In fact, that happened in the life of Swami Brahmananda much later when Swami Brahmananda was an older man. And long after Sri Ramakrishna had passed away, he was at Balaram Babu's house. And he put on, I forget whether it was a tiger skin or a bear skin, one or the other, and tried to frighten one of the children out of play. And the child started shaking and crying and said, Maharaj, I know it's you, but still I'm scared. And so the idea is that he's trying to get across is that once Maya is recognized, meaning deeply, not just conceptually, that's good to get it conceptually. That's where we start. We get a conceptual idea of what is what, and then we try to internalize it. But once that's been internalized, then we come to a point where well, one actually feels that Maya has no lure at all. Now, when that spirit comes where one recognizes Maya and says, "You can't fool me anymore." Again, desires and things may come over the mind. But once one has had that experience where you feel the lure of Maya has gone completely and you can look Maya in the face and say, "I have nothing to do with you." Once you've had a taste of that, then it's something that you can come back to. And that's a general truth in spiritual life, that if we can get a taste of anything in spiritual life, just a small taste, it gives us something that we can keep coming back to when later the veil of Maya comes back over the mind. For instance, the mind is so full of noise, always chattering and so forth. If we can somehow get a few moments where the mind becomes completely quiet and we feel an inner peace like we've never felt before, well, then the noise of the mind starts up again because we're not yet at a stage where that has become permanent. We've just gotten a taste of it. But that taste gives us something that we can keep coming back to. When in the midst of the mind's noise, we remember that peace that we felt, then it gives us something to aim towards. It doesn't mean that immediately we go back to it. No, it may be a long time before we get back to it and make it permanent. But having a taste of something, it gives us something to keep going back towards. That's why if we get a taste of something, we should dwell on it, meditate on it, cherish it, because it creates a memory that we can go back to. If we have a moment where we feel deep devotion, deep, genuine, unselfish devotion for God, then that gives us a taste of something higher that we can go back to at other times when the mind is distracted and we don't feel much devotion. And so here, there is a state where one suddenly feels that nothing within Maya is attractive, and one feels that one can stare Maya in the face and be unaffected by it. But usually that goes. We're not yet ready for that to be our permanent state. But it gives us a taste which we can remember even when the the desires of the mind come back. So he continues, all women are the embodiments of Shakti. It is the primal power that has become women and appears to us in the form of women. It is said in the Adhyatma Ramayana that Narada and others praised Ram, saying, O Ram, thou alone art all that we see as male, and Sita all that we see as female. Thou art Indra, and Sita is Indrani. Thou art Shiva, and Sita is Shivani. Thou art man, and Sita is woman. What more need I say? Thou alone dost exist wherever there is a male, and Sita wherever there is a female. So this is an idea that Sri Ramakrishna used to teach in various ways, to look on all women as manifestations of the Divine Mother, as the Divine Shakti. And here he gives the corresponding idea of looking on all men as the Purusha, whether it's Shiva or Indra or Rama, whatever. And so the idea is to try to see all human forms as divine forms. At first, we can try, because it's easier, we can try to see that God is within everyone. It's harder to see everyone as God, but that's what we eventually want. So in the beginning, we start with seeing everyone as an image of God, or God is within everybody. But eventually, what we want to do is to see that everyone is the divine being itself. So if we start, as Swami Yatishwarananda says, how many of our human problems would be solved if we could look on all men as Sri Ramakrishna and all women as the Holy Mother? That would change our relationship to everything in the world. But of course, that's difficult. But again, we can start by thinking that God is within the person. But we shouldn't stop until we see that God is the person. To the devotees. Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention on this paragraph. that there is an even higher state than this, seeing all women as Sita and all men as Rama, etc. And that is where you don't see the distinction between men and women, where all men and women are Ram, or all men and women are Sita. All men and women are Shiva, all men and women are Kali, whatever your chosen ideal is, where you no longer see a distinction between men and women. That's an even higher state. But again, Sri Ramakrishna is giving a graduated teaching here, something that is easier for most people to hold on to. Then Sri Ramakrishna addresses himself to the devotees. He was looking at him and speaking, but the two or three others, whoever was there, it doesn't say here who was with him. But he says to the devotees gathered, one cannot renounce by the mere wish. There are prarabdha karma, inherited tendencies, and the like. Once a yogi said to a king, live with me in the forest and think of God. The king replied, that I cannot very well do. I could live with you, but I still have the desire for enjoyment. If I live in this forest, perhaps I shall create a kingdom even here. I still have desires. So the king, in that respect, had more self-awareness than the yogi did about himself. He realized that, no, I'm not ready for that. And that, of course, reminds us of the story Sri Ramakrishna tells of the man who, in disgust with his wife, he left the house and said, I'm going to Benares to renounce the world. So he goes to Benares, and after a few months he writes, please pack up the children and all of our things and bring them to Benares because I've started a business here. so it's not enough to run to Benares, leaving everything. We have to leave ourselves first. So the king was wiser in this instance than the yogi was. So he says, Sri Ramakrishna says at the top of the paragraph, one cannot renounce by the mere wish. That is, just because I want to renounce doesn't mean I will be able to. I have to be in this proper state where I can do it. And also, unless one is possessed of extreme renunciation, unless one is possessed by genuine, lasting, extreme renunciation, one can't renounce unless one has made provisions for one's legitimate responsibilities. In ordinary life, we often get into trouble, we make trouble for ourselves by taking on responsibilities that are not really ours, just because we're busybodies and we can't leave things alone. And so we take on all sorts of responsibilities we don't need to. But there are legitimate responsibilities, things that we can't give up without committing a moral offense. And so those we have to take care of. So that's why Sri Ramakrishna says one cannot renounce by the mere wish. There are such things as prarabdha karma. So one has to look at one's situation. First of all, one's fitness, and then one's situation, if the situation allows for it, for it to be done in a good and ethical manner. Even those young people who have not entered into marriage or anything like that, or work commitments or anything, who come to Belar Mutt to join. I don't know nowadays if they do it. I hope they do, because it was always done in the past 100 years of the order. The young man would be asked, who do you have at home and who do you have to take care of them? And if the person said, I'm an only son, but my parents are of means, then they might allow him to join. But if he said, I'm the only son and my parents are very poor, then he wouldn't be allowed to join. He would be told to go and serve his parents, that was his dharma. And so we have prarabdha, past karma, that has to be tended to. We have to see our real responsibilities, not imagined responsibilities, but real responsibilities. And as I said, our capacity. So Swami Ananda used to say that two things are in the hands of the Divine Mother that we have no control over. We can try to control the situation, but we really don't. He said, Marriage and renunciation. Those two things we have no control over. Whether it's in the stars, and I'm not advocating astrology by saying that, I'm just using a general expression as an expression, nothing more than that. If it's in the stars for us to marry, then even if we try to renounce the world, we will end up married. If it's in the stars for us to renounce the world, one way or another, we're going to be pushed in that direction. And so we have to do going forward in life. The vast majority of us have no one present who can tell us, well, now go this way, now go this way, take this decision, take that decision. We have to make decisions blindly most of the time, taking the best information we have and then just doing the best we can. But doing that, we find that we will go one way or the other according to our prarabdha karma. And so that's what Swami Aseshananda meant. Not that one shouldn't try to do what one thinks is the right thing to do in questions of marriage or sannyasa, but that we're going to eventually be guided in that way no matter what it is we think we want or need. So that's also included in what Sri Ramakrishna says, one cannot renounce by the mere wish. Natabor Panja used to look after his cows in this garden, meaning the Dakshineshwar garden. He's speaking about an actual person in an actual event in the Dakshineshwar garden. Natabor Panja used to look after his cows in this garden during his boyhood. He had many desires. Hence, he has established a castor oil factory and earned a great deal of money. He has a prosperous castor oil business at Alambajar. And so why does he bring this up? And why does he bring up the boy herding his cows here in this garden? It's because the garden of Dakshineshwar has become a place of sadhana, a place that's very holy. And here this boy used to herd his cows there, and yet the holy association of the place, it meant nothing to the boy. He had desires, and so he ended up starting a castor oil business. So then he continues, there is one sect that prescribes spiritual discipline in company with women. I was once taken to the women belonging to the Karta Bhaja sect. They all sat around me. I addressed them as mother. At that they whispered among themselves, he is a pravartaka. He doesn't know the way. According to that sect, the pravartaka is the beginner. Then comes the sadhaka, the struggling aspirant, and last of all, the siddha of the siddhas, the supremely perfect. A woman walked over to Vaishnav Charan and sat near him. Asked about it, Vaishnav Charan answered, she feels just like a young girl. One quickly strays from the religious path by looking on woman as wife, but to regard her as mother is a pure attitude. So here, of course, he's talking about a tantric sect, a tantric Vaishnava sect, the Karta Bhajas. Vaishnav Charan, who was one of those who recognized Sri Ramakrishna as an avatara, was a member of that sect. And there were others that Sri Ramakrishna knew at that time who belonged to the sect. And as he says, he was invited to their one of their circles where they would have practice. And so he addressed the women who were there for tantric practice with the men, addressed them as mother, and the women whispered to themselves, he's just a beginner, meaning that he doesn't understand that there's a higher state where he engages with us. And so, of course, Sri Ramakrishna is criticizing their understanding because they saw him, because of his attitude towards them as mother, they thought that he's just a beginner. He's still afraid of women. But of course, Sri Ramakrishna was already a siddha of siddhas, more than a Karta Bhaja siddha. So, and he indicates here that it's the only place I've seen where he indicates some criticism of Vaishnav Charan. Usually he's very respectful of Vaishnav Charan, but here he indicates some criticism of him. Then the narration begins. This is not a quotation of Sri Ramakrishna. Some of the devotees took leave of the master, saying that they were going to visit the temple of Kali and several of the other temples. And as we'll see in what follows immediately, M also got up and went out. M went walking alone in the Panchavati and other places in the temple garden. He thought about the master's assurance that God can be easily realized and about his exhortation to lead a life of intense renunciation, and his saying that Maya, when recognized, takes to flight. At 3:30 in the afternoon, M again entered the master's room and sat on the floor. A teacher from the Broughton Institution had come with several students to pay a visit to Sri Ramakrishna. They were conversing together. Now and then the teacher asked questions. The conversation was about the worship of images. So let me stop here and ask any of the Bengalis if you know the Broughton Institution. Does it still exist, or do you know what kind of institution it was? Anyone? Deepak, do you know? No. Okay. I don't know what the Broughton Institution was, whether it was English missionaries that ran it, or whether it was, obviously it was a school, but whether it was an English missionaries or whether it's connected to the Brahmo Samaj. With a name like the Broughton Institution, it probably was either run by the British government or by missionaries. So anyway, they arrived. A teacher arrived with several students, and they began to talk about the worship of images. Master to the teacher: what is wrong with image worship? The Vedanta says that Brahman manifests itself where there is existence, light, and love. Therefore, nothing exists but Brahman. And so again, this was something that Sri Ramakrishna was constantly faced with, because the Christian missionaries had taught against image worship. The English in general taught against it. And the Brahmo Samaj, which was influenced by Christian ideas, they taught against it. And even groups like the Arya Samaj, which was not directly influenced by Christian missionaries, it was trying to find a Vedic teaching, which in their ideas was a purified Vedic teaching. They taught against it as well. And so this mood against image worship had pervaded Indian society. And of course, it still continued among the common people, and some higher class, some people who weren't just among the common people as well. But the idea had spread far and wide and influenced many, many people. Most of those who came to Sri Ramakrishna were influenced by this idea, at least those who came to him after his period of sadhana was over. Most of them, like Keshav Chandra Sen and others, were influenced by this idea. So Sri Ramakrishna had to face it many times. And so he says, what is wrong with image worship? The Vedanta says that Brahman manifests itself as existence, light, and love, and therefore nothing exists but Brahman. So why does nothing exist but Brahman? Because Brahman is Sat Chit Ananda, existence, light, which is Chit, and Ananda can be bliss or love. It means that it comes to the same thing. Bliss is love fulfilled. Love as yearning is one thing, and love as fulfillment is bliss. And so Brahman is that. And that is the very nature of everything in the universe. Everything in the universe is a manifestation of existence. Everything seems to have being. It has light, that is, we can see it. It manifests, prakasha. It manifests to our minds. That's how we perceive it. And love, priya. So asti bhati priya is probably, I should have looked at the Bengali on this to see, but he probably says asti bhati priya. Asti being bhati meaning shining, manifesting, and priya meaning dear or love. So existence, light, and love. Then he continues, how long do small girls play with their dolls? As long as they are not married and do not live with their husbands. After marriage, they put the dolls away in a box. What further need is there for worshiping the image after the vision of God? So this we see in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. Not that he, after the vision of God, he disparaged images. He still would go to the Kali temple. He would bow down and pray to Mother Kali, but not because he needed to anymore, because he saw the Mother Kali living wherever he looked. He saw the living Mother Kali. But again, he didn't disparage that which went before. There's a passage in a Christian text called The Cloud of Unknowing, which is a great mystical text from 14th century England by an anonymous author. And he says the same, gives the same idea in a Christian context, that after you have finished drinking a glass of wine, you don't throw the glass and break it. No, you set it down respectfully. So the idea is that that which has helped you to a higher state where it's no longer needed, you don't disparage it because you recognize that this had its utility. I've gone beyond it. I don't need it now, but it had its utility. And so that's the idea Sri Ramakrishna is giving here. That just as girls play with their dolls until they meet their husband and join their husband, go to the husband's house, then they put their dolls in a box and have no more interest in the dolls. And so a person who worships images until they see the living God. And once that happens, then there's no more need for it. But again, that doesn't mean disparagement of the image. It's like Jatadhari, the great saint, the devotee of Ram Lala, the child Rama, who worshipped Ram Lala every day. Was the center of his spiritual life. And he came to Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna had the vision of Ram Lala, the child Rama, and beautiful chapter in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. But in the company of Sri Ramakrishna, Jatadhari had the vision of the living Ram Lala. And so when he left the garden after some time, he gave the image to Sri Ramakrishna. He no longer needed it because it had fulfilled its purpose. And so again, that's the idea that Sri Ramakrishna is giving here. The master glanced at him. So he had been speaking to the teacher and students of the Broughton Institution, but now he glanced at him and said, "One attains God when one feels yearning for him. An intense restlessness is needed. Through it, the whole mind goes to God." So here perhaps, and this is just a guess, we don't know, but perhaps Sri Ramakrishna looked at him because this teaching would not have done the teacher and the students any good. They weren't ready for that. They weren't ready to understand what yearning for God was, or the purpose of it, or the hunger for the realization of God. But he turns to him and tells him, because him is ready. A man had a daughter who became a widow when she was very young. She had never known her husband. She noticed the husbands of other girls and said one day to her father, "Where is my husband?" The father replied, "Govinda, that is Krishna, is your husband. He will come to you if you call him." At these words, the girl went to her room, closed the door, and cried to Govinda, saying, "Oh, Govinda, come to me. Show yourself to me. Why don't you come?" God could not resist the girl's piteous cry and appeared before her. And then he tells a couple of other stories, similar stories. One must have childlike faith and the intense yearning that a child feels to see its mother. That yearning is like the red sky in the east at dawn. After such a sky, the sun must rise. Immediately after that yearning, one sees God. So he would often say this, that when one feels intense yearning for God, that's like the rosy dawn before the sun appears. But when you see the rosy dawn, you know that the sun is coming. There's no doubt. It's just a question of a short time. And so when one has intense yearning for God, then that's the rosy dawn, which says that the vision of God is coming soon. Let me tell you the story of a boy named Jatila. He used to walk to school, and let me mention that this Swami Vivekananda told this story. It's one of the chapters in the complete works. He told the story in its more complete form than is given here by Sri Ramakrishna to a Western audience. Let me tell you the story of a boy named Jatila. He used to walk to school through the woods, and the journey frightened him. One day he told his mother of his fear. She replied, "Why should you be afraid? Call Madhusudan," that is Krishna. "Mother," asked the boy, "who is Madhusudan?" The mother said, "He's your elder brother." One day after this, when the boy again felt afraid in the woods, he cried out, "Oh, brother Madhusudan," but there was no response. He began to weep aloud. "Where are you, brother Madhusudan? Come to me. I'm afraid." Then God could no longer stay away. He appeared before the boy and said, "Here I am. Why are you frightened?" And so saying, he took the boy out of the woods and showed him the way to school. When he took leave of the boy, God said, "I will come whenever you call me. Do not be afraid." Then Sri Ramakrishna continues, "One must have this faith of a child, this yearning." So Sri Ramakrishna used to often tell stories like this, that the faith of a child, when we're growing up, we gradually learn to lose faith because we find that there are many things in the world that cheat us. When we start out as small children, we have faith in everything because we've been protected by our parents. Our parents love us. They show us that they love us. They're there protecting us, caring for us. And so we have no fear of anything in the world. And we think that the whole world is like that because of the protective care of our parents. And that's a great thing. That's the best thing that parents can give to their children, the feeling that they are secure and that they are loved. That's the foundation for a healthy life. But as we grow up, even as small children, we begin to find that the world is not as safe as we thought it was. We begin to find that there are things that hurt us. We begin to find that there's people who hurt us, who cheat us, and so forth. And so gradually, as we grow up, we learn to mistrust the world. And that's a necessary part of experience also, because there are things in the world that will hurt us. There are people that will hurt us. The problem is that then we find it hard to have faith in things in general. And so in spiritual life, a large part of spiritual life is learning where we should not put our faith and where we should put our faith. That's the secret, one of the secrets of spiritual life, learning where to put our faith, where we can have 100% faith without any concern, and where we should not put our faith. Because as we grow up, because of desires and impulses and so forth, we begin to put our faith in that which will fulfill our desires for ordinary happiness. But in spite of the fact that we're cheated over and over again by the world, we still have the hope that the world is going to give us satisfaction, but it won't. So learning not to put our faith there, but to put our faith in God is the secret of spiritual life. And so Sri Ramakrishna says that one must have this faith of a child, this yearning. It's interesting, one of the values of comparative religion is that it gives us greater faith in our own path when we see the same ideas repeated in other spiritual traditions. And so there's a beautiful movie that I don't know when it was made, probably in the 50s. It was an old black and white movie before the days of color movies. So it might have been the 40s or the 50s. A movie in Spanish made in Spain called Marcelino, Pan y Vino. Marcelino, Pan y Vino. It's a very famous movie. Meaning Marcelino is the name of a little boy, bread and wine. There's Marcelino, bread and wine. And so it's about this little boy who's brought up in a monastery. And it's the same type of story where his faith brings the living experience of God to him. It's a very beautifully done movie. Then Sri Ramakrishna goes to another story. A Brahmin used to worship his family deity daily with food offerings. One day he had to go away on business. As he was about to leave the house, he said to his young son, "Give the offering to the deity today." See that God is fed." The boy offered food in the shrine, but the image remained silent on the altar. It would neither talk nor eat. The boy waited a long time, but still the image did not move. But the boy firmly believed that God would come down from his throne, sit on the floor, and partake of the food. Again and again he prayed to the deity, saying, "O Lord, come down and eat the food. It's already very late. I cannot sit here any longer." But the image did not utter a word. The boy burst into tears and cried, "O Lord, my father asked me to feed you. Why won't you come down? Why won't you eat from my hands?" The boy wept for some time with a longing soul. At last, the deity, smiling, came down from the altar and sat before the meal and ate it. After feeding the deity, the boy came out of the shrine. His relatives said, "The worship is over. Now bring away the offering." "Yes," said the boy, "the worship is over, but God has eaten everything." "How is that?" asked the relatives. The boy replied innocently, "Why, God has eaten the food." They entered the shrine and were speechless with wonder to see that the deity had really eaten every bit of the offering. So again, there's such stories in different traditions. Even in traditions that are against image worship, like in the Christian tradition, you find such stories. And of course, the child was lucky that he had parents who were willing to believe him. Otherwise, the parents would have said, "You ate that food. I know you did." So the parents had enough spiritual sensitivity to both to know the goodness of the boy, that he wasn't lying, and that it was really possible for the deity to eat the food. Namdev, yes. Yes, so Deiten is saying, for those of you listening on the internet, that this story is taken from the life of Namdev, a great Maharashtrian saint. Maharashtra had, like all regions of India, Maharashtra had a great tradition of many great saints, Tukaram, Namdev, Dyaneshwar, etc. So Namdev was a great saint, and this was what happened in his life. Late in the afternoon, Sri Ramakrishna was talking to Im. They were standing on the south side of the Nahabat. Since it was winter, the master was wrapped in his woolen shawl. "Master, where will you sleep? In the hut in the Panchavati?" Im. "Won't they let me have the room on the upper floor of the Nahabat?" Im selected the Nahabat because he had a poetic temperament. From there, he could see the sky, the Ganges, the moonlight, and the flowers in the garden. Master, "Oh, they'll let you have it. But I suggested the Panchavati because so much contemplation and meditation have been practiced there, and the name of God has been chanted there so often." So Sri Ramakrishna himself had practiced sadhana in the kutir, in the hut. And that was where Totapuri had initiated him into sannyasa, where he spent 3 days and nights in Nirvikalpa Samadhi after his initiation into Samadhi. And there were other sadhus who had come and stayed there and done spiritual practice. So unfortunately, it no longer exists. There's a replica built some years ago, but the actual hut no longer exists. But Sri Ramakrishna suggests to him, "Why I suggested the Panchavati for this reason. Its association with so much austerity, so much realization, so much repetition of God's names." But again, him being poetic by nature, he thought that sleeping in the Nahabat, he could look at the Ganges, look at the moon and the stars, see the temple and all of that. It was evening. Incense was burning in the master's room. He was sitting on the small couch, absorbed in meditation. Im was sitting on the floor with Rakhal, Latu, and Ramlal. So Rakhal, later Swami Brahmananda, Latu, later Swami Adbhutananda, and Ramlal, Sri Ramakrishna's own nephew. The master said to Im, "The sum and substance of the whole thing is to cultivate devotion for God and love Him. At Sri Ramakrishna's request, Ramlal sang a few songs, the master himself singing the first line of each. Ramlal sang, "Oh, what a vision I have beheld in Keshav Bharati's hut." So let me stop so that the song has meaning as I read it rather than afterwards explaining it. That Keshav Bharati was the sannyasin who initiated Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu into sannyasa. And so that's why he's speaking. And Gora, whom he speaks of in the next line, is one of the several names for Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Oh, what a vision I have held in Keshav Bharati's hut. Gora in all his matchless grace, shedding tears in 1,000 streams. Like a mad elephant, he dances in ecstasy and sings drunk with an overwhelming love. So a beautiful song about Sri Chaitanya's ecstasy when he's initiated into sannyasa by Keshav Bharati. And just one other thing, let me mention here. It says dancing like a mad elephant, dancing in ecstasy and so forth. So Sri Chaitanya, Sri Ramakrishna, both of them, when in ecstasy, their dance was something regal. There was something majestic about it. That's why it's like a mad elephant. Mad because mad with a divine love, not mad because they were crazy, not that kind of madness, but mad with divine love. And like an elephant because there was something majestic, something regal about their dance. Then he sang, Ramlal, though and this is Krishna speaking as I in the song, though I am never loath to grant salvation, mukti, I hesitate indeed to grant pure love, prema. Whoever wins pure love surpasses all. He is adored by men. He triumphs over the three worlds. So Sri Ramakrishna used to say this, and Holy Mother later used to say this also, that God grants mukti, liberation, fairly easily. But prema is very difficult. That is a supreme, all-absorbing divine love. That is rare. So mukti is God grants relatively easily. That may not seem so to us because we'd be quite satisfied with mukti. But mukti is easier than we think. It's not easy, but easier than we think, because mukti means the mukti liberation simply means that we have gone beyond the bonds of karma. We've gone beyond the bonds of karma. And for that, yes, it's a high state compared to where we are, but it's not that high a state. It's when we have given up the idea of I am the doer. And so for that, one need not even attain to one need not attain to nirvikalpa samadhi. One need not attain to a deep state of ecstasy. When one's surrender to God or one's identification with the self goes far enough that I no longer feel that I'm the doer, then I'm beyond the bonds of karma. Then for me, there is no more karma. But the knowledge of the self in absorption in Brahman, or the ecstatic love of God, prema, then those two are much higher than just liberation. So Holy Mother used to quote these words also and say that God gives liberation to many, but prema only to a few. Sri Ramakrishna said to Ramlal, "Sing that one, Gaur and Nitai, ye blessed brothers." Ramlal began to sing the song and the master joined him. So Gaur means Sri Chaitanya and Nitai means Nityananda, his companion. Gaur and Nitai, ye blessed brothers, I have heard how kind you are, and therefore I have come to you. When I visited Benares, Shiva, Lord of Kashi, told me of the Parabrahman's birth as man in Mother Sachi's home. Sachi was the mother of Sri Chaitanya. O Brahman, thee I recognize, that is addressing Gora and Nitai. O Brahman, thee I recognize. Many a sadhu I have seen, but never one so kind as you. Once at Braja, that is Vrindavan, you were born. Once at Braja, you were born as Kanai, that is, and Balai, that is Krishna and Balaram. You were born as Kanai and Balai, his brother. Now, once more in Nadia, as Gaur and Nitai, as Sri Chaitanya and Nityananda, do you appear, hiding the shapes that then you wore, that is, hiding the shapes of Krishna and Balaram, though they are the same born again. In Braja's pastures running freely, once you frolicked. Now for play you roll on the ground in Nadia, chanting about Lord Hari's name. Laughing, shouting, once you played at Braja with your cowherd friends, and now you chant Lord Hari's name. O Gaur, how cleverly you hide the dark blue form you wore at Braja, the form of Krishna. But your slanting eyes betray you. That is, he had the lotus eyes like Sri Krishna. But your slanting eyes betray you. Through the blessing of your name, the sinner is set free, they say. And so my soul is filled with hope. Now with eager heart, I hasten to your feet. Lord, I implore you, keep me safe within their shadow. You redeemed Jagai and Madhai, wretched sinners though they were. I pray you, do the same for me. I have heard that you embrace all men as brothers, even the outcast, whispering in the ears of all Lord Hari's name, Lord Hari's life-renewing name. And so here again we see something that I mentioned from time to time in lectures and classes, that reform in Hinduism always came through religious teachers. That idea which is being spread in academia, Western academia, that Hinduism is just a system of caste oppression and women oppression and so forth, nothing could be further from the truth. They ignore the principles and teachings of Hinduism and only look at abuses that arose in society, which you can find in any society. If someone said that Christianity is nothing but the burning of witches and the excesses of the crusades and so forth, the abuses that can be found in Christian society, then that would be a travesty. So the same is true of Hinduism. As here it says that you embrace all men as brothers, even the outcast. So for Sri Chaitanya, as for others like Sri Ram and others, there were no outcasts. So now go ahead and finish this chapter because there's just a short passage here to finish. Late at night, M sat alone in the Nahabat. So M had wanted to sleep in the Nahabat, so he went there instead of taking Sri Ramakrishna's suggestion of the Panchavati. Late at night, M sat alone in the Nahabat. The sky, the river, the garden, the steeples of the temples, the trees, and the Panchavati were flooded with moonlight. Deep silence reigned everywhere, broken only by the melodious murmuring of the Ganges. So again, you see M's poetic nature, which he himself admitted a few paragraphs ago. M was meditating on Sri Ramakrishna. At 3 o'clock in the morning, M left his seat. He proceeded toward the Panchavati as Sri Ramakrishna had suggested. He didn't care for the Nahabat anymore and resolved to stay in the hut in the Panchavati. So he, in spite of Sri Ramakrishna suggesting he go to the Panchavati, he had thought, oh no, I know better, I will enjoy the Nahabat more. So he goes there and he ends up losing all taste for the Nahabat and going to the Panchavati where Sri Ramakrishna had told him, suggested that he go to begin with. Suddenly he heard a distant sound as if someone were wailing piteously. Oh, where art thou, brother Madhusudan? The light of the full moon streamed through the thick foliage of the Panchavati, and as he proceeded, he saw at a distance one of the master's disciples sitting there alone in the grove, crying helplessly, Oh, where art thou, brother Madhusudana? Silently, M watched him. So that, of course, is referring back to the story that we just read, that Sri Ramakrishna told about the boy who had to go through the forest to get to school and told his mother that he was terribly afraid walking alone in the forest. And his mother told him, well, when you're afraid, call out to Brother Madhusudana. He will protect you. And the boy cried, and Sri Krishna, that is Madhusudana, appeared and told him, I'm your brother. Whenever you need me, call to me. And so one of the other disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, listening to that story, as Sri Ramakrishna told it, now at night was out in the jungle of the garden, crying out to Madhusudana. So silently M watched him. So thus we come to an end of a beautiful chapter. So let me give announcements, and then if there are questions, I will take questions. For announcements, on Sunday, I will speak on Sri Ramakrishna at the usual time. And from this past Sunday, we are now open to people to come to the live service. We'll continue the live streaming, but you're invited to come and join us here in the temple as well for classes and lectures, as long as the COVID situation continues in its downward trend as it is now. And so on Sunday, again, the lecture will be open. There's no registration, just come. And it will be, as I said, on Sri Ramakrishna in honor of Sri Ramakrishna's coming birth celebration. On Tuesday, instead of the Upanishad class, we will have Shivaratri, because Tuesday, the 1st of March, is this year Shivaratri. And so we will have the worship here. You are invited to come to the worship. No need to register. It will be at 7 o'clock in the evening until 8:30. And so we will collapse the 4 praharas, the 4 watches of the night, and the 4 worships in the 4 watches into one watch on Tuesday night. And then Thursday we'll have this class, the gospel class as usual. And then Saturday we will have the worship of Sri Ramakrishna. His actual birthday on the Indian calendar is March 4th this year, but we will observe it on the 5th Saturday so that more people can come. So you're welcome to come, invited to come in person. We won't have a full meal of prasad given out in the tent as we normally do, because again, we are taking some precaution because of the COVID situation. But you are invited to come, and we will give out prasad for people to take with them. So that will be at 10:30 until 12:30, the worship of Sri Ramakrishna. Let me also mention that for all of these activities, we do require that people wear masks and socially distance, and that you be fully vaccinated. But that being the case, you're most welcome and encouraged to come. So one can see existence and knowledge, how to perceive the bliss aspect everywhere. Yes, that's true. And it's because we can see existence everywhere, everything that is exists. Something that doesn't exist is not. And so we don't have to worry about that. There's no such thing as non-existence. Everything has being, everything has existence, and that existence is Brahman. So that we see everywhere. Everything that is, it has the power to manifest to our intelligence, to our perception, either directly through the senses or through the extended senses of modern scientific instrumentation. All that modern technology has done through its scientific instrumentation is extend the senses to realms where the senses couldn't reach before, and so empowered the senses to perceive things that were not sensible before. And so everything manifests, everything shines. That is, it manifests to our consciousness. That's how we know that it is. So everything that is has the ability to make itself known if we have the right senses or extensions of the senses. And so existence and the power to manifest to consciousness, that is the power of shining, which is the power of consciousness within everything, that we can see everywhere. That's easy to see. But the question is that what about the dearness of things, which is the Ananda aspect of Brahman. Everything doesn't look dear. There are many things that we don't like. Most of us are not too fond of mosquitoes. Most are not too fond of poisonous snakes. Most are not too fond of disease germs and so forth. And so there are many things that, and there are people that we don't like. And so there are many things that don't seem dear. But the best explanation, there have been explanations that the great acharyas have given, which I won't go into, philosophical explanations, which aren't fully satisfying, but it's an attempt to explain why existence and consciousness is obvious everywhere if we know how to look for it, but bliss or dearness, priyatva, is not. The best way I know to explain it is that yes, even that is all pervasive, because if we find, and you find this in the record of people who almost lost their lives, people who almost lost their lives, suddenly when their life is spared, everything looks dear. Everything looks dear. Even the people that they didn't like before, everything looks dear. And we realize that yes, the things that we don't like in this life, we don't like them on the surface of the mind because they're not conducive to our surface happiness. But there's a deeper sense of dearness which keeps us attached to the world, even in the midst of all of the suffering that we go through. And so in that way, at least, we can see that everything is dear. And when we come to a higher state, as all of the acharyas have said, that's part of their argument. When we come to a higher state, we see that everything is filled with the bliss of Brahman, that it was always there, we just couldn't see it. So I think that was the last. Let's see. There's another name for Ananda, unity. Yes, Ananda, because love. Love is what? Love as yearning. Unfulfilled love is yearning for unity. Even human love, all types of love, is the love for unity. And love fulfilled is the experience of unity. And that experience is bliss. So in that way, one could say that, yes, unity is bliss, because unity is fulfillment. So with that, I'll give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidhyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namamaha. We bow in adoration to Sri Ramakrishna, who is stainless, eternal, infinite, the worshipful Supreme Lord, who took human birth out of compassion for all. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all.